ladies and gentlemen. Together with MEP Marion Maréchal, who will join us shortly, she's due to speak in the plenary at this very moment. I am delighted to welcome you to this important conference, Civil War, Europe at Risk. To address this vital issue, we are joined by 4 distinguished experts: Professor David Betz, Professor of War in the Modern World in the Department of War Studies at King's College, London; Maitre Thibault de Montbrial, President of the Centre de Réflexion sur la Sécurité Intérieure, CRSI, France; Dr. Ralph Schoellhammer, lecturer and head of the Center for Applied History and International Relations Theory at the Matthias Corvinus Collegium; and Dr. Eoin Lenihan, journalist and researcher based in the Republic of Ireland. Before we begin, let me recall a timeless warning from the Bible, Galatians 6:7. Whatsoever a man soweth, so shall he also reap. One of the most profound and dangerous consequences of the relentless mass migration into Western democracies is that our once relatively homogeneous societies have become deeply fragmented. Newcomers often share little in common with the indigenous population. More alarmingly, many have no intention of assimilating. Significant numbers seek instead to preserve their own cultures and religious beliefs that frequently stand in direct opposition to our Western values, while holding that their way is right and ours is wrong. As a father, I constantly ask myself, what does this mean for our societies and for our children and grandchildren? Where are we heading? Where will Europe be in 50 years? Will there be a Europe in 50 years? Those who refuse to discuss the failures of mass migration and instead police free speech by labeling all criticism as extremism or hate are not preventing conflict. They think they are, but they are manufacturing it. By suppressing debate and turning legitimate concerns into taboos, they are the ones turning our societies into pressure cookers. A recent Ipsos survey published in November 2025, named The State of Democracy 2025, proves exactly where this leads. Satisfaction with democracy is collapsing across Western Europe, with majorities in every country fearing for its future. Sweden, my own country, however, is the striking exception, where a clear majority is satisfied and optimistic. And this, my friends, shows a powerful truth. When politicians finally stand with their own people, the political system regains its legitimacy. So maybe it's time for the virtue signaling crowd to finally admit that it is we, the so-called hateful right-wing populists, who are in fact the knights in shining armor riding to the rescue of our threatened democracy. But igniting political change is not enough. That change must also stabilize our entire system and society. This is a long-term rescue mission. I think it will take generations. A true restoration of the cohesion that once defined our nations. a cohesion I grew up with, a cohesion that some of you in the audience have only heard of. So, ladies and gentlemen, have political movements such as the Sweden Democrats, who have long warned that Europe is drifting toward civil conflict, have we been right? Or have we simply been scaremongers, as our detractors claim? It is precisely to answer these urgent questions that my colleague Marion and I have organized this seminar. We hope you will find it both enlightening and deeply relevant. And without further ado, as she has arrived now, I will give the floor to my dear colleague from France, Marion Maréchal, for her opening remarks. The floor is yours, Marion.
Je vais parler en français. Alors, chers amis, merci pour votre présence à tous aujourd'hui. Merci à mon ami et collègue Charlie Weimers. Merci à mon ami et collègue Charlie Weimers pour cette initiative qui s'inscrit dans le cadre de notre groupe de travail sur l'immigration. Merci évidemment à tous nos intervenants du jour qui sont des experts en la matière et qui vont nous éclairer sur ce sujet extrêmement sensible du risque de la guerre civile. Je me réjouis tout particulièrement d'avoir à ma gauche Maître Thibault de Montbrial. Merci beaucoup, Maître, d'avoir accepté de venir aujourd'hui. Je me permets une rapide présentation de l'expert français autour de cette table, qui est avocat au barreau de Paris depuis maintenant près de 30 ans, qui a été l'avocat de multiples victimes du terrorisme islamiste dans notre pays, qui a notamment défendu d'ailleurs les victimes des attentats du Bataclan, triste épisode pour ceux qui s'en souviennent, au cœur de Paris. Vous êtes également président du Centre de réflexion sur la sécurité intérieure et vous intervenez régulièrement dans les médias. Vous êtes également un auteur, puisque vous avez fait paraître Le sursaut ou le chaos en 2015, Osons l'autorité en 2020, ainsi que France, le choc ou la chute, entre autres publications. Vous êtes aussi un militaire, c'est important de le préciser. Et avant de laisser la parole à nos invités, j'aimerais vous dire quelques mots sur les raisons de cette conférence. La principale raison, d'abord, c'est un constat, un triste constat, puisque nos sociétés qui vivaient depuis des années de façon paisible et pacifique sont en train de muter sous nos yeux à grande vitesse en société de violence et en société de défiance. L'étude d'ailleurs publiée récemment par notre fondation ECR sur les no-go zones est une des manifestations de ce terrifiant phénomène. Alors pour une raison simple, puisque le critère principal de la confiance entre des citoyens, c'est l'homogénéité culturelle. C'est la clé de voûte du bon fonctionnement de la démocratie et même du bon fonctionnement de l'État-providence. Or, cette homogénéité culturelle, elle a été pulvérisée par l'immigration de masse, l'islamisation et le multiculturalisme. Un Français, Pierre Beaurechamp, qui est un ancien des services de renseignement extérieur français, a détaillé de façon très intéressante dans une interview les facteurs liés à l'immigration qui contribuent à cette désagrégation sociale. Il parle de l'origine de populations du tiers-monde, de mœurs communautaires, de mœurs musulmanes, de culture de l'honneur, du passé colonisé, d'une démographie dynamique, d'une endogamie élevée, d'un faible niveau socio-culturel, d'une coagulation en isolat géographique et d'une aggravation de toutes ces dispositions au fil des générations dans un contexte global de vengeance du Sud vers le Nord. Et de ce point de vue, d'ailleurs, la distinction entre guerre civile et guerre étrangère ressort brouillée. Ce sont ces mots. Car en effet, le terme même de guerre civile pourrait prêter à débat en ce qui concerne la situation actuelle en Europe. Parce que traditionnellement, la définition de la guerre civile correspond à une lutte armée entre deux factions organisées au sein d'une même population, c'est-à-dire au sein d'un même peuple. Et en l'espèce, nous sommes face à un cas hybride, puisque les dissensions et les affrontements qui opposent ces personnes sont des personnes de même nationalité administrative, mais qui, de fait, ne semblent plus appartenir à la même civilisation. Et donc, en cela, la frontière entre guerre civile et guerre étrangère est floue. Et je crois qu'il n'y a pas de parallèle possible entre ce que nous vivons actuellement dans les quartiers dits sensibles et les anciennes guerres civiles françaises que furent, par exemple, la Révolution, la Commune, l'affrontement entre Armagnacs et Bourguignons ou catholiques et protestants. Il n'y a pas non plus, d'ailleurs, de bandes organisées au sens strict, puisqu'il y a d'un côté en effet des peuples autochtones qui sont mus par l'individualisme et auxquels s'agrègent des populations immigrées assimilées, mais cet ensemble-là ne résonne pas en termes communautaires et encore moins évidemment en termes raciaux. Et de l'autre, on a un agrégat de populations extra-européennes aux origines diverses, tenues par des allégeances nationales variées, mais liées par une religion commune qui est l'islam, et dont beaucoup sont animés par un sentiment de revanche post-coloniale, mais qui n'en tire pas pour autant un objectif politique clair et précis. Et puis entre les deux, il y a une zone grise, mouvante et indéfinie. Il n'y a pas non plus de lutte armée au sens strict, mais il y a une forme de guérilla diffuse qui prend des formes variées allant d'émeutes à des pillages, à des agressions gratuites, à du racisme anti-blanc, à des attentats, avec systématiquement une défiance de tout ce qui incarne l'autorité de l'État, du pompier au policier. Alors voilà pour poser un peu les termes et même ouvrir le débat sur ce terme même de guerre civile et ce qu'il peut impliquer. Et pour conclure, je crois qu'on peut dire que ce colloque est salutaire parce qu'il va nous permettre de comprendre non seulement plus nettement ce phénomène, de comprendre aussi la trajectoire finalement qui se dessine et surtout, les solutions que nous, responsables politiques, devons mettre en place pour sauver nos pays de l'horreur qu'est la guerre civile et de la régression, évidemment, sociale, culturelle, économique, géopolitique qui s'en suivra si par malheur elle devait advenir. Et donc, sur ces mots, je laisse maintenant la parole à nos intervenants. Je vous remercie.
So the first one to take the floor is Professor David J. Betz of King's College in the United Kingdom. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. The title of tonight's talk, I can see on the screen, has a question mark at the end of it, and I don't think it needs to be there because I believe that Europe is on track for civil war, and I'll explain why that is the case in a moment. For a start, though, I would like to address a question that almost always comes up when people accept the argument presented to them, which is, in which country, David, do you think this is going to happen first? The short answer is that it's a very tight race. Sweden, France, Germany, Spain, Britain, others are all strong contenders to win this dismal race. But if forced to guess, with all respect to my co-panelist, I would choose Ireland because it has a relatively recent history of civil conflict, a tradition of nationalist martyrdom, and a spectacularly tone-deaf political establishment. The extended answer, though, is that it doesn't really matter too much who goes first, because once it kicks off any place, it is quite likely to spread to every place. One of the strongest predictors of the likelihood of civil war occurring in any country is whether there is one occurring in a neighboring country. In my talk this evening, I'm mostly going to talk about Britain because that's the case I know most well. I live there, and most of my detailed research is on that subject. Wherever you are from in Western Europe, however, you will recognize elements of what I'm talking about, I'm certain, from your own national experience. Moreover, should some of you be from even more distant quarters of the Western world, the United States or Canada or even far off Australia, I know that you will feel something the same. The matter is, in my opinion, in the largest sense, that the crisis of the Western world today is a kind of civilizational hangover brought on by the slow motion collapse of the modern project which began something over 200 years ago. I say all that now at the start because while I'll be talking about recent polls and studies and newspaper headlines of recent vintage showing matters of concern and the like, it is important to stress that the most important drivers of the coming civil war are structural and long-term. It took a long time to break the foundations of Western self-belief, prosperity, and competency. If you care about those things, you are likely very, very angry. As Karl Popper warned, unlimited tolerance must result in the destruction of tolerance itself. So that anger is understandable if you feel it. It will take a long time to fix the damage that has been done, and in answer to the questions that have just been posed, I'm not sure it is in fact possible to fix it. Let's get to Britain. Britain today is in the condition of what the American writer Samuel Francis called anarcho-tyranny. This may be defined as a condition of government which combines two apparent opposites. First, oppressive power against the innocent, and second, paralysis in performing core duties of government. This may be seen most obviously in the generation-long failure to prevent, to punish, or even to seriously investigate the mass rape, trafficking, torture, and murder of primarily white working-class children by primarily Pakistani community-based sexual torture networks, combined with the increasing determination to repress the habitually law-abiding native population through censorship, through hate crime enforcement, through social engineering, and frankly, 1984 levels of surveillance. More generally, every aspect of the political economy is in crisis or in incipient ruin. Nothing works. Britain has been broken. Who broke it? Why did they break it? Whether it deserved to be broken? Over these matters, people may argue. Over the essential premise, however, I don't think there's much room for debate. So where does that lead us? Broken Britain, or indeed shattered Britain, as a recent report put it, are common ways of describing the current situation. The appropriate academic term is factionalized, which is worth briefly defining conceptually. Factionalism is a condition of society in which the titular group, the titular nation, tribe, what have you, divides or splits into smaller, nearly always competing subgroups that pursue their own interests and their own goals as a greater priority than, or sometimes in direct contradiction with, those of the larger group. You can consider it a spectrum. On the one end of the spectrum, you have normal politics, followed by contentious politics, then comes issue factionalism, polar factionalism, militancy, and then civil war. Normal politics doesn't need a lot of explanation. Under normal political conditions, nobody bothers to question legitimacy. It's a fundamental assumption. As an example of contentious politics, you might consider 2011's Occupy Wall Street and other global anti-austerity movements. Issue factionalism is when competing groups start to form around discrete substantive issues such as abortion or the death penalty. Polar factionalism occurs when political competition shifts from disagreement over specific issues to entrenched symbolic identity cleavages. Sustained polar factionalism produces social breakdown, which is typified by the emergence of militancy, which is effectively organized coercive action. Unless government, by whatever means at that stage, restores its legitimate monopoly of violence, then the next step is civil war. Britain currently is in a state of polar factionalism. It's not quite at the point of societal breakdown, but we are already observing outbreaks of militancy from some groups, most recent example of this being the torching in London of 4 ambulances funded by the Jewish community. At this point, it's worth going back for a moment to Francis's concept of anarcho-tyranny, because it's very important, I think, to note that anarcho-tyranny arises not simply out of incompetence, but because elite interests are served by weakening self-government, by eroding traditional institutions and middle-class stability. To reiterate, the current explosive configuration of society did not occur naturally, nor did it arise democratically. It developed as a direct result of elite choice. More than any other issue, as we've heard, policy on immigration exposes the duplicity of elites and the resulting depth and breadth of the canyon between governments and the governed. Since 1945 in Britain, both the Conservative and Labour parties repeatedly promised in their election manifestos to deliver only managed and controlled immigration, yet both oversaw net mass migration exceeding 200,000 annually for about 17 years each. According to Great Replacement theory, white European populations are being systematically replaced by non-white immigrants through deliberate policies of mass migration and higher birth rates amongst minorities. The idea is derided in polite company, but according to a 2023 survey in the UK, approximately 32% of adults believe it to be real. I would be astonished in 2026 if you did that poll again, if the number was not considerably greater than 32%. Is it any wonder then that so many heretofore completely normal people now talk about betrayal and so vitriolically aim the word traitor at national political leaders? I would say no. People are angry, and they are right to be so. But the people at whom they are angry are far from repentant. At the 2025 Glastonbury Festival, a scene occurred which I feel serves as a kind of microcosm of this relationship. When the musician or the band Bob Vylan sang the song, "I Heard You Want Your Country Back," to a wildly cheering crowd of elites, or elite proto-elites. Here's the song's chorus. I won't sing it to you. I'll read it. "I heard you want your country back. Shut the fuck up. I heard you want your country back. You can't have that." Let us admit that these are fighting words. They are not hard to find on either side of the divide. It stands to reason that when people want to fight and actively seek to provoke that, it is a strong likelihood that a fight is going to happen. First, then, I suppose that we are on a track for a peasant revolt, a conservative uprising in which the ruled seek to punish their rulers for violating their obligations under the social contract and for changing the existing rules of the game against their wishes. It will look something like Italy's years of lead, the dirty wars of Latin America, or maybe more the troubles in Northern Ireland, but on a larger scale. What is already a guarded society will become a radically, even more heavily fortified society as elites seek protection by more walls, more guards, and more surveillance. That is going to be bloody. In red team simulations of this sort of conflict, which we have done, we find that the red teams usually decide to target judges and media figures. In the first instance, these targets chosen on account of their relatively unguarded condition and accessibility, a product of the mistaken expectation of security on their part. Another key factor is their perceived centrality in two oft-invoked grievances: two-tier justice and media bias or media manipulation. The second thing that is going to occur is the balkanization of British life along ethnic lines. I'll slow down. The second thing that is going to occur is the balkanization of British life along ethnic lines. What I call a sortative movement is in fact already occurring, in some ways quite obviously in places like Tower Hamlets in London, Spark Hill in Birmingham, and a dozen other places across an east-west strip of the north of the country, which are already effectively ethnic enclaves, zones of negotiated policing with parallel legal systems, alternative economies, and, as the recent rape gang inquiry illuminated, zones of endemic and large-scale outgroup sexual predation. Somewhat less obvious is the acceleration of white flight from the major cities. and particularly the spread of the phenomenon to the more affluent. This is apparent in the real estate market. If you talk to real estate dealers in provincial towns which are close to but outside of London, where we have many people selling up in London to buy in what they perceive to be safer places. This ought to be more generally frightening. In government, there are plenty of people who understand fully the gravity of the situation, though it is still career-wise terminal to speak about it openly. But that awareness is what scared them so greatly about the Raise the Flag movements, which are ongoing. When already divided communities start to demarcate their territory in ways such as that, it is a strong sign that that society is approaching its flashpoint. The main tactic in this second sort of civil war, the balkanized form of civil war, will be a very old one. It will be the siege of urban areas with a few 21st century twists. In many ways, it will be reminiscent of the siege of Sarajevo, but much more dominated by paramilitary actors using system disruption tactics. Most importantly, infrastructure attack, to degrade or destroy the life support systems of urban non-native enclaves. How much time do I have left?
Please continue to.
Okay, feel free to prod me if I'm going over time. The political object of this conflict is very simple, in this conflict is very simple. It is to compel non-natives to leave. The strategy is to create conditions of life in the cities that are so intolerable that leaving is preferable to staying. The tactics are relatively simple. They require few sophisticated weapons, or in fact no weapons, and are quite hard to guard against. When I say it requires no weapons, the appropriate weapons for infrastructure attack are things like angle grinders, sledgehammers, and perhaps acetylene torches and the like. It's not an implausible theory of victory because its central premise, which is the instability of the modern urban condition, at the best of times, is something which scholars of urban studies have been warning against for 50 years already. Again, in red team simulations of this sort of conflict, players often resolve on attacking the fuel distribution system, particularly the petrol stations of cities that are targeted for disruption. Again, the logic is simple and devastating. Fuel systems are easy to attack. They're flammable, if not explosive by definition. They are difficult to repair and expensive to replace. In fact, they're impossible to replace in civil war conditions where there is no insurance available. Moreover, disruption of fuel has very rapid knock-on effects on everything else logistically, most importantly, the food distribution system, which is the traditional weapon of siegecraft. In summary of what I've said so far, there's a lot of tinder. The country is a powder keg. You can choose your own metaphor. What will be the spark? The truth is that it is in the nature of sparks that no one can predict them precisely. Southport might have been one, which explains why the government reacted in the manner that it did, in a panic, betraying all the classic signs of decision-making under fear: tunnel vision, bias amplification, and cognitive overload. The trouble is that there's no shortage of potential flashpoints, because when you pile up the tinder everywhere, it's bound to catch light somewhere and to spread. I'm coming to the end. Where does balkanization lead us? I see two strong possibilities here. The first is that it leads effectively to the extinguishment of Britain in the sense of a coherent cultural entity dominated by people genuinely sharing the titular identity of British. In his essay, The Lion and the Unicorn, George Orwell supposed from the perspective of 1940 that there was a meaningful connection and a continuing obligation between the British he was actually speaking of the English, of his time and the people of the same place in 1840, 100 years before, despite all the changes that had occurred in that 100-year period. His answer was a very decisive yes. On our current course, no one in 2040 could conclude the same thing. That connection between past, present, and future generations, which in fact is the essence of Burkean conservatism, will have been severed. Indeed, it will have been betrayed, in the sense that it didn't have to happen that way. It was rather an elite choice, going back to my earlier observation. The second possibility is that it leads to large-scale and widespread civil war, as I have described, with three primary belligerents. I've mentioned already the likely strategy and tactics that will be adopted. I think in the time remaining, I'll just say a few words about the role of government. When revolutions occur, probably the most important determinant of outcome is which way the army, or security services generally, decide to direct their loyalty. If it sticks with the government, then elites generally prevail. If the army goes with the people, then elites generally fail and they go to Madame Guillotine. If it stays neutral, then events might favor either side. What I'm about to say then is controversial because I do not think that in the coming conflict, the military is going to play a decisive role. There are good reasons to conclude this. Some may surprise you. First, as is well known, Western armed forces are by historical standards today very small. They are also very focused on external expeditionary warfare, not domestic action, though many, including the British military, have a role in aid to the civil power, in which role they have some experience and have done some training. Second, police forces are also small, and that fraction of the police force which is specifically trained and equipped for the most arduous public order policing tasks is very, very small indeed. On top of that, the strengths in undercover policing and infiltration, which used to be based on old special branch, have been eviscerated. We know this because of evidence produced by the ongoing undercover policing inquiry. Basically, if you are not blathering online about what you intend to do, the government does not have a clue. The third, the political reliability of the rank and file of the armed forces is firmly rooted in the local native population. In Northern Ireland, we knew better than to try to deploy Irish regiments. Where is the government going to find non-English regiments to police England? The loyalty even of the top SAS is also dubious, in my opinion, given that they have recently been targeted by lawfare on the part of their own government. My working assumption then is that the role of government and military and police forces in the coming conflict will mostly be neutral. To start, will focus essentially on securing as much as it can of elite enclave normality while letting events play out in the wider national sphere until the tipping point where elites detect who is going to win, then they'll join that team. Beyond that, my confidence in my powers of future telling are exhausted. It is very possible that the Britons end up like the Canaanites or the Akkadians, a people of historical interest, their monuments visible here and there in some sort of ruination of interest to archaeologists and historians. That would be a tragedy, but that is a very viable option in front of us. And in fact, it is a possibility that is quite close. So far, I've talked rather qualitatively. People often think that's subjective, so I'm going to conclude with some numbers. People regard those as more objective, but they're wrong in that. But anyway, if you're comforted by numbers, here I will give you some. 31%. 31%. That is the number of respondents to a 2024 poll who agreed with the statement that civil war in the next 10 years was likely or very likely. Again, if that poll was taken today, I'd be astonished if it was not a larger number than 31%. 80% and 60% are the numbers of respondents in the same poll who felt that the country was respectively in a dire state and could only get worse. 9%. 9% is the number of Britons, according to the British Social Attitudes Survey, who agree that politicians may be fully trusted. 72% is the number of Britons who, according to the British Social Attitudes Survey, agree that politicians are only in it for themselves. 53% of Britons, according to a Hansard report, believe that voting makes no difference to who is in power, which is the most commonly stated political opinion in the country. It is also a true statement according to a great deal of authoritative scholarly research. When it comes to disagreement between elite and street, as we see in the immigration debate, elite always wins. 100% it wins. People have noticed this fact, moreover. 32% agree with the statement that a great replacement is occurring, as I've mentioned. 60% and 17%. These are the numbers of Britons between the ages of 18 and 34 who agree, respectively, that some sort of hostile activism is permissible to drive change, and that violence is included in this permissible category. So 17% of 18 to 34-year-olds think that violence is permissible to drive change. If you're wondering what the overall number is, that's 2.25 million people, which is a pretty good recruitment pool, I suggest. 31% is the number of Britons who concluded in a study done last summer with the statement, when I think about the political and social institutions of this country, I can't help but think, burn it all down. 4 to 11 is the average length in years of civil wars in the post-1945 era. There are a range of estimates. I conclude with that number because I don't think that civil war can be avoided. I think the minds of responsible, smart people like yourselves now should be on mitigation strategies. How do you minimize the damage that is going to occur? The most important factor in minimizing damage is reducing the duration of conflict. This is going to happen, in my opinion, probably sooner than you think, and there are serious, well-grounded historical and empirical reasons to believe that the most important thing is to get it over with fast. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Betz. That was absolutely fascinating, and a lot of food for thought for us here, but I think for everyone listening on X and on other platforms as well. So now I'm honored to give the floor to Maitre Thibault de Montbrial, President of the Centre de Réflexion sur la Sécurité Intérieure à la France. Bienvenue.
Vous vous souvenez tous des Jeux Olympiques de Sarajevo en 1984. Vous étiez plus ou moins jeune, mais vous avez regardé à la télé les athlètes, vous avez regardé les gens fraterniser, danser au pied des drapeaux, comme devant ce bâtiment du Parlement européen, et se retrouver dans des restaurants pour faire la fête entre différentes nationalités. Vous vous souvenez tous, 7 ans plus tard, de la ville de Sarajevo en siège, avec cette fameuse Sniper Alley, où la performance sportive constituait non plus à gagner une médaille olympique, mais à traverser la rue sans se faire tirer dessus par un sniper. En 7 ans, la ville de Sarajevo était passée du symbole de la paix, du symbole olympique, au symbole de l'effondrement d'un pays et de la guerre civile. Ce qu'il faut garder à l'esprit, mesdames et messieurs, c'est que en matière d'histoire, comme pour tout ce qui concerne les relations humaines, rien n'est jamais acquis. Rien n'est jamais acquis. Ce que je vais vous dire pendant les 24 minutes 30 qui me restent, je vais vous le dire en parlant d'une triple position. Ma première, c'est que je suis avocat depuis plus de 30 ans et que je défends notamment, régulièrement, les forces de sécurité intérieure françaises. La deuxième, on me demande de parler plus doucement. I'll do my best. La deuxième, c'est que je suis donc président du seul think tank français qui travaille sur ces questions de sécurité et de souveraineté. Et qu'à ce titre, je rencontre plusieurs fois par semaine les principaux acteurs français et parfois internationaux sur ces sujets qui me parlent en off au moins aussi souvent que ce qu'ils disent dans les médias ou devant les représentants nationaux et internationaux on the record. Et ma troisième casquette, Marion Maréchal y a fait brièvement allusion, c'est que quand j'étais jeune, j'ai servi dans les parachutistes français et aujourd'hui, je suis officier de réserve opérationnelle dans la gendarmerie nationale, ce qui fait que j'ai également une expérience de terrain qui, je vous l'avoue, aujourd'hui est plutôt modeste, mais qui a le mérite d'exister et de me permettre d'aller prendre le pouls à la base, le pouls de ce qui se passe dans mon pays. La première raison pour laquelle nous sommes, à mon avis, sur un toboggan qui pourrait nous mener vers des affrontements très graves, elle est paradoxale. C'est que la France et l'Europe de l'Ouest, et notamment grâce à l'Union européenne, vit depuis 80 ans en paix. Ce moment de paix est inédit dans l'histoire de l'Europe. Jamais il y a eu 80 ans sans conflit. Et au milieu des multiples effets bénéfiques de cette parenthèse historique, il y a des effets qui sont des effets pervers. Le principal effet pervers, c'est que nous avons collectivement perdu, génération après génération, la sensation dans nos tripes, dans notre ventre, de savoir qu'il est essentiel d'être prêt à se battre pour conserver ce qu'on a. On s'est mis à tout relativiser. Nos grands-parents qui ont connu les guerres sont morts. Ils ont arrêté de parler à leurs petits-enfants, à leurs arrière-petits-enfants. Et aujourd'hui, nous vivons dans une société où les enfants qui naissent en Europe de l'Ouest sont exposés à un monde où tout est relatif, où le fait d'avoir une histoire et des racines passe complètement au second plan, à côté de nombreuses illuminations et illusions individualistes, consuméristes, où nous n'avons plus rien qui, à la base, à la naissance et dans le système scolaire, rattache nos enfants à la tradition de ce qu'ils sont, de ce qu'est leur terre et de ce pourquoi leurs grands-parents et arrière-grands-parents se sont battus. Or, dans le même temps, la population européenne, depuis 40 ans, change. Le professeur Betz y a fait allusion. Il y a peut-être pas encore un changement de population, mais en tout cas une évolution de la composition de la population européenne, ce qui en soi n'est pas un problème. Mais là où ça le devient, c'est la conjonction de deux choses. La première, c'est que l'immense majorité des gens qui entrent en Europe depuis 40 ans ne partagent pas notre culture, ni notre mode de vie. Mais ce ne serait pas en soi un problème s'il n'y avait pas le second facteur. Le second facteur, c'est que ce sont essentiellement des gens de culture et de religion arabo-musulmane, ce qui là encore en soi n'est pas une difficulté, mais où ça le devient lorsque, si l'on s'intéresse de près aux travaux des islamistes, des frères musulmans, des salafistes, eh bien, on comprend que cette population est ciblée par ceux qui, dans une logique politique de l'islam, considèrent que nous sommes une terre de conquête et que l'instrument de la conquête doit être une fraction de la population migrante depuis 40 ans. Le but, à leurs yeux, je vous renvoie aux dizaines de sources écrites et publiques et vidéos sur le sujet, c'est de casser l'intégration, c'est de désintégrer cette population qui, normalement, comme toutes les populations migrantes, a vocation petit à petit à s'intégrer. Et moi, je pense que la seule intégration possible, c'est l'assimilation à la terre qui les accueille. Nous avons donc une fracture de plus en plus visible entre, d'une part, des Européens d'origine qui ont perdu la sensation de ce qu'ils sont, et d'autre part, une fraction de la population des gens qui arrivent en Europe et qui considèrent que cette terre peut être conquise. Alors, le concept de guerre civile, il implique de rentrer dans des définitions dans lesquelles je ne vais pas rentrer, parce que j'ai des choses beaucoup plus concrètes à vous dire. Je pose néanmoins dans le débat le fait que, à mes yeux, mais peut-être que lorsque nous échangerons, nous ne serons pas tous d'accord, une guerre civile implique des camps de belligérants identifiés. On sait qui est le camp A, on sait qui est le camp B, et il y a une confrontation, un choc des volontés, pour reprendre l'expression de Clausewitz, entre A et B, avec des objectifs de conquête. Je pense, pour ma part, qu'en France, il n'y a pas encore, vous entendez le encore, de camp B structuré. Il y a un camp A, qui est la République française, dont les institutions sont en déliquescence et qui s'est considérablement ramolli et qui a oublié qu'un État ne peut se perdurer que si il y a un pacte social qui est respecté et dont la cohérence est assurée par l'exercice de l'autorité de l'État. Le camp B, ça impliquerait que nous ayons en France des populations qui se regroupent avec un chef identifié, avec un commandement identifié, et je pense que pour l'instant, ce n'est pas encore le cas. Mais ce qui, je pense, va arriver inéluctablement, et le professeur Betz a commencé son propos en disant qu'on pourrait enlever le point d'interrogation sur le titre de notre colloque du jour. Je suis d'accord, peut-être pas avec une guerre civile au sens de deux camps l'un contre l'autre, mais au sens d'une très grande vague de violence qui serait très vite incontrôlée par l'État. C'est-à-dire que l'État serait débordé et que nous aurions extrêmement vite, quand je dis vite, c'est en quelques jours, si ce n'est en quelques heures, des dizaines puis des centaines de morts avec une perte de contrôle de l'État central pendant plusieurs semaines. C'est le scénario dont je pense qu'il a des chances statistiques suffisamment sérieuses d'arriver dans les mois et les années qui viennent pour que l'on en parle quelques minutes ensemble. Alors, l'état des lieux, mesdames et messieurs, en France, c'est d'abord que la France est un pays aujourd'hui très fracturé. Il y a des fractures territoriales et économiques. Les centres-villes sont abandonnés parce qu'ils sont trop chers. Les centres périurbains ont été laissés aux populations migrantes. Et donc, l'immense majorité de la population française d'origine qui n'a pas les moyens est repoussée à plus de 20 ou 30 kilomètres des centres-villes. On lui a vendu beaucoup la Startup Nation avec Internet depuis 10 ans. Mais le problème, c'est qu'il y a une partie de ces zones qui sont encore blanches. C'est-à-dire que les gens ont besoin d'Internet pour vivre, mais que parfois, ils ne peuvent pas y avoir accès facilement. La 5G n'est pas installée partout. Et en plus, il faut utiliser sa voiture pour aller travailler, pour aller faire des courses, voire pour se connecter à Internet. Or, les écologistes nous expliquent que la voiture, c'est mal. Donc, vous avez des gens qui, de ce fait, perdent confiance, d'une part, dans la classe politique, et d'autre part, et c'est encore plus grave, sont en train de perdre confiance dans les institutions. Or, ce sont deux points dont le professeur Betz, dans ses travaux, explique que ce sont des préalables à la possibilité de la rupture. La deuxième fracture, j'en ai déjà parlé, mais je la remets là parce que, évidemment, il est absolument crucial de l'avoir à l'esprit, c'est la fracture ethno-territoriale, ethnique par le fait de cette immigration massive depuis 40 ans, territoriale parce que ces populations se regroupent. Et je vous invite, si vous ne l'avez pas fait, à regarder les images de dimanche soir en France après le deuxième tour des élections municipales. Et vous verrez que certaines mairies qui ont été conquises par l'extrême gauche, souvent avec des candidats issus de l'immigration, ont donné lieu à des scènes à la fois de liesse, ce qui est bien normal quand on a gagné une élection, mais de liesse haineuse. C'est-à-dire qu'au lieu de féliciter son adversaire, eh bien très souvent, les vaincus ont été humiliés et ont été chassés physiquement de la mairie en dehors du respect des principes de base de la vie républicaine, par des gens, par des foules dont il est très intéressant de les regarder physiquement. Regardez ces vidéos avec le son et regardez-les sans le son et vous en tirerez les conclusions qu'il y a à en tirer. L'effondrement de l'autorité de l'État, je vous en ai dit un mot. Sachez qu'en France, la violence n'arrête pas d'augmenter, qu'on bat des records année après année. Je vous donne que 2 chiffres. Il y a en France une agression physique par minute et le nombre de meurtres et de tentatives de meurtre, puisqu'un meurtre, ça n'est jamais qu'une tentative qui a réussi, a doublé en 12 ans. Les principales victimes de la violence en France sont les forces de sécurité intérieure. Une victime de violence sur 4 est policier ou gendarme. Je ne sais pas si vous vous rendez compte de ce que ça implique. Mais également, au-delà des policiers et des gendarmes, les services de secours, les pompiers, les ambulanciers, les élus. Le nombre d'agressions contre les élus a doublé en 3 ans. Mais également les professeurs, les enseignants, ceux qui ont cette charge magnifique d'enseigner à nos enfants et qui sont ciblés parce que les gens qui veulent nous déstabiliser ont parfaitement compris que le nerf de la guerre, c'est évidemment l'éducation et que si on veut qu'un État s'effondre sur une génération, il suffit d'empêcher que la nouvelle génération soit instruite. Les derniers qui sont ciblés, aussi incroyable que ça paraisse, ce sont les médecins et les services de santé, les infirmières, les gens qui se déplacent à domicile, mais également la violence qui progresse dans les hôpitaux. En clair, mesdames et messieurs, ce sont tous les métiers qui sont directement ou symboliquement assimilés à l'autorité de l'État. Tout ce qui fait qu'un État fonctionne est aujourd'hui ciblé par la violence et par la délinquance. La dynamique actuelle est une dynamique qui est très favorable à la délinquance, très défavorable à la police et à la gendarmerie. Je vais vous dire une phrase que les policiers et les gendarmes me disent très souvent. Ils me disent, et j'ouvre les guillemets, moi, je n'ose plus sortir de ma voiture parce que si je sors de ma voiture, j'ai le choix entre l'hôpital ou la morgue si je suis grièvement blessé ou tué, d'un côté, ou la prison de l'autre, si j'utilise la force que la loi me permet d'utiliser pour protéger mes concitoyens, parce que les juges me jugeront très sévèrement et d'une façon déconnectée par rapport aux besoins opérationnels et à la réalité du droit. Sans surprise, cet effondrement de l'autorité de l'État laisse la place à des contre-cultures. Et je pense que c'est au sein de ces 2 contre-cultures que se trouve le terreau d'un affrontement à venir sur notre territoire. Le premier, c'est la grande criminalité organisée. La criminalité organisée en Europe, bien sûr, mais puisque je suis là pour parler de la France, je vous parle de la France, elle explose avec des statistiques depuis la fin de la crise sanitaire du Covid, c'est-à-dire depuis moins de 5 ans, des statistiques qui sont affolantes et galopantes. J'attire votre attention sur le fait que nous vivons un changement en termes de criminalité en Europe avec des effets sur le terrain, sur la violence, sur la corruption, sur le blanchiment d'argent, qui sont des effets à une vitesse qui n'ont jamais été observés depuis la fin de la Deuxième Guerre mondiale, ni avant d'ailleurs, puisque il n'y avait pas de sujet de cette nature organisé sur le plan international. Il y a là un véritable facteur d'effondrement en soi, avec des bandes qui sont souvent mieux équipées en matière de communication, mieux équipées en matière de transport et mieux équipées en matière d'armement que les services étatiques qui sont chargés de lutter contre eux. La deuxième contre-culture, c'est évidemment l'islamisme, avec l'islam violent, bien sûr. Ce sont les attentats ou les agressions plus ou moins directement commises au nom de cette religion, mais également avec l'islam qui se prétend non violent et qui, dans la ligne directe des préceptes des frères musulmans, a choisi d'utiliser les faiblesses des Européens et les faiblesses des Français en particulier pour travailler à saper et à nous miner de l'intérieur, hélas souvent avec la collaboration au moins d'un grand parti politique en France, qui est la France insoumise. Dernier point là-dessus, pour que vous compreniez la pénétration entre la grande criminalité organisée et l'islamisme, il n'y a pas de lien structurel, mais on estime, c'est une estimation des services de renseignement français, que 80 à 90% des figures majeures de la criminalité organisée en France sont d'origine arabo-musulmane. Le deuxième point que je voulais aborder, c'est que nous avons en France des signaux de moins en moins faibles d'une dégénérescence de la situation. D'abord, je vais passer très vite parce que vous les connaissez, il y a les attentats islamistes qui se sont multipliés sur le territoire européen depuis le milieu de la décennie précédente. Aujourd'hui, ils sont moins spectaculaires, sans doute pour un temps, mais ce n'est pas le sujet du jour, mais il y a des attaques de basse intensité au couteau, avec des véhicules béliers, ou même à main nue, qui sont commis par des gens qui invoquent l'islamisme quasiment tous les jours sur le territoire français. Ils ne sont évidemment pas considérés par les autorités comme des attentats et ils ne sont pas considérés par la presse comme des événements qui méritent qu'on les relate. Pourquoi? Tout simplement parce qu'on s'habitue et parce que ce qui faisait la une de l'actualité il y a 20 ans, aujourd'hui n'est même plus traité par les médias, parce que ce qui arrivait une fois toutes les 6 semaines ou 8 semaines il y a 20 ans arrive aujourd'hui plusieurs fois par jour. Le deuxième facteur le deuxième signal faible, c'est l'expansion de la violence d'extrême gauche. Vous avez une violence d'extrême gauche qui est quasi terroriste et en ce qu'elle s'attaque de façon structurée aux infractions qui sont aux opérateurs, ce qu'on appelle les opérateurs d'importance vitaux, l'énergie, les communications et les transports. Vous avez peut-être vu que pendant le Festival du cinéma de Cannes, au mois de mai 2025, il y a eu une attaque contre le système électrique du département des Alpes-Maritimes, où a lieu le Festival de Cannes, et qu'il y a à peu près 200 000 personnes qui ont été privées d'électricité pendant 24 heures. Il y a des gens qui ont estimé que c'était drôle et que, je cite, les riches à Cannes seraient obligés de manger des sandwichs au lieu d'aller dans les grands restaurants. Mais ceux qui ont trouvé beaucoup moins drôle, c'est la population, c'est les gens qui allaient travailler, c'est les gens qui, dans les hôpitaux, n'ont pas pu être soignés parce que les générateurs n'étaient pas assez puissants, etc., etc., etc. Vous avez également eu en France des grands mouvements de désobéissance civile, comme la ZAD, c'était la zone à défendre. Je ne sais pas comment les traducteurs vont s'en sortir avec ça, mais ce sont des territoires qui ont été confisqués, occupés par l'extrême gauche, parfois pendant des années, pour s'opposer à des projets de grandes infrastructures. La zone à défendre de Notre-Dame-des-Landes, c'était près de Nantes, c'était pour protester contre un aéroport, malgré la volonté populaire de voir construit cet aéroport. Et pour finir, on a dû déloger les gens qui occupaient ce terrain depuis 4 ans en utilisant des forces d'élite de la gendarmerie et avec des combats extrêmement violents qui ont duré plusieurs semaines et qui ont fait des centaines de blessés, en particulier chez les forces de l'ordre. Vous avez également une explosion de la violence dans les manifestations. Les manifestations qu'il peut y avoir contre des réformes économiques ou contre des réformes sociétales sont aujourd'hui en France systématiquement infiltrées et pourries par une ultra-gauche qui souvent prépositionne plusieurs jours avant sur le lieu de la manifestation des armes telles que des boules de pétanque avec de l'acide à l'intérieur et des petites ailes en lame de rasoir qui sont mises sur le côté, qui sont jetées sur des policiers et autres outils de cette nature. Donc il n'y a pas d'armes à feu, mais il y a tout sauf les armes à feu et on a régulièrement des policiers très gravement blessés lors de ces occasions. Attentats islamistes, extrême gauche, mais évidemment aussi les émeutes et les émeutes en particulier dans les quartiers. Il faut que vous sachiez, mesdames et messieurs, qu'en France, des émeutes, il y en a tous les jours. Depuis 4 jours, par exemple, là on est mercredi, depuis samedi dernier, il y a des émeutes dans une cité qui est près de Lyon qui s'appelle Rieux-la-Pape. À chaque fois, il y a un incident local qui sert de prétexte et pendant plusieurs nuits, les jeunes, comme on dit, vont affronter la police, vont mettre le feu à un certain nombre de matériel. Et des violences, des violences, des violences. J'avais prévu, mais je n'aurai pas le temps, de vous faire un petit comparatif entre les chiffres des violences urbaines de 2023, dont vous vous souvenez, au début de l'été en France, et les chiffres de 2005. En 2005, ça avait duré 3 semaines, en 2023, ça a duré 5 jours. Ce qu'il faut que vous reteniez, c'est que quels que soient les critères, l'endroit, le nombre d'endroits considérés en France, l'ampleur, la violence, le nombre de blessés, le nombre de policiers et de gendarmes engagés, tous les chiffres entre 2023 et 2005 sont multipliés par des ratios qui vont de multiplier par 2 jusqu'à multiplier par 4, alors qu'en 2005, donc ça a duré 3 semaines, et qu'en 2023, ça n'a duré que 5 jours. La raison pour laquelle il n'y a pas eu de mort en 2023 est exclusivement parce que les caïds, c'est-à-dire les chefs de la grande criminalité organisée, n'ont pas voulu donner les armes de guerre, dont on sait qu'il y en a beaucoup en France, aux émeutiers, parce qu'ils savaient que si les émeutiers commençaient à tuer des policiers, à rentrer dans des cités, dans les villes, à piller, à violer et à tuer, il y aurait un état d'urgence et que ce serait, pendant plusieurs semaines, une situation de chaos qui serait mauvaise pour les affaires. Mais là où je voulais en venir, mesdames et messieurs, c'est que, d'abord, le sujet n'est plus tabou. Il faut que vous sachiez que le sujet de notre conférence du jour, aujourd'hui, c'est un sujet qui est traité par la police et la gendarmerie comme étant possible. Personne ne viendra vous le dire publiquement. Mais alors qu'il y a quelques années, quand le middle management de la police et de la gendarmerie attendait, tirait la sonnette d'alarme, disait, comme le professeur Betz, comme moi et comme d'autres, que nous étions sur le point de vivre ces scènes, eh bien, plus vous montiez dans l'administration, plus les gens, perdant de vue la réalité du terrain, les grands chefs disaient non, non, ils exagèrent, parfois ils font le jeu de l'extrême droite, etc. Et donc, il fallait considérer que ça n'était pas possible. Aujourd'hui, mesdames et messieurs, ce sont des scénarios sur lesquels, sans le dire publiquement, et sans évidemment que je rentre dans les détails maintenant, mais il faut que vous sachiez que la police, la gendarmerie et les armées travaillent et considèrent que des scénarios tels que ceux dont on parle sont possibles. Ils ont, il faut le dire, une raison de le faire en pouvant dire que ces scénarios sont un peu pensés sans pour autant faire stigmatiser qui que ce soit et rentrer trop dans les détails des raisons profondes pour lesquelles nous pouvons en arriver là. Pourquoi ? Parce qu'il y a un facteur aggravant à tout ce que nous disons, c'est que la situation internationale a complètement changé depuis quelques années et qu'il y a plusieurs pays qui, chacun pour des raisons qui lui sont propres, ont intérêt à déstabiliser l'Europe de l'intérieur. Et que ces pays ont parfaitement identifié, parce qu'ils ne sont pas plus bêtes que les autres, nos faiblesses internes. Et que si vous voulez rendre la France ou l'Angleterre, qui sont les deux pays qui aujourd'hui ont les armées théoriquement les plus puissantes, encore que la montée en force de nos amis polonais devrait permettre de revoir ce classement. Mais la France et l'Angleterre, si d'aventure, elles se posaient la question d'un engagement en dehors des frontières européennes, que ce soit à l'Est ou au Moyen-Orient, elles pourraient très vite voir cette hypothèse politique remise en cause si des émeutes ou des événements très graves se déroulaient sur leur sol, soudain, déclenchés par des mains qui seraient des mains locales, mais ces mains seraient peut-être armées et financées par des gens qui viennent de l'extérieur. Et donc, il y a là un outil dont il ne faut pas perdre de vue, que cet outil qui consiste à déstabiliser des pays qui ont perdu l'autorité et qui sont en train de perdre le contrôle de l'ordre public chez eux, peuvent être facilement déstabilisés par des plans qui sont des plans qui viennent de l'étranger. Ce qu'a dit le docteur Betz sur la théorie des dominos, c'est-à-dire le jour où ça commencera quelque part, ça ira très vite, c'est quelque chose auquel je crois profondément. Ce que je crois, moi, c'est que la rationalité business qui fait que les grands criminels n'ont pas donné les armes de guerre aux jeunes en 2023, cette rationalité volera en éclats le jour où il y aura un événement national ou international qui fera que leur sentiment d'appartenance à la communauté arabo-musulmane, par l'émotion que déclenchera l'acte qui sera à l'origine du départ des événements, eh bien, viendra exploser, l'émotion viendra exploser la rationalité des chefs d'entreprise criminels qui n'ont pas intérêt au désordre. Et ce jour-là, mesdames et messieurs, nous aurons un déferlement de violence parce qu'il ne faut pas se leurrer, et je termine par là, il y a en France et en Europe énormément d'armes de guerre qui circulent. Un des grands tabous, c'est que Vous connaissez le détournement des stocks de la guerre civile de Yougoslavie dans les années 90. Mais le grand tabou aujourd'hui, c'est le détournement des stocks de l'aide à l'Ukraine. Il y a énormément d'armes qui ont été qui étaient destinées au théâtre ukrainien, qui ont disparu. Il y a beaucoup de mafias en Ukraine. Et parmi ces armes, il y a des fusils d'assaut, bien sûr, des pistolets, bien sûr, mais on a des raisons de penser, en tout cas c'est ce que pense le service de renseignement français, qu'il y a également de l'armement anti-char et de l'armement anti-aérien léger qui, sans doute, viendrait compliquer la tâche de nos forces de sécurité intérieure le moment venu. Pour conclure, je vous dirais simplement qu'il est grand temps, et c'est pour ça que c'était utile de se voir cet après-midi, de se réveiller collectivement. Se réveiller collectivement, ça ne veut pas dire se lancer dans des aventures politiques incontrôlées et dans la panique. Ça veut dire simplement se rappeler, comme je le disais pour commencer, que rien n'est jamais acquis et que la première chose à laquelle les politiques européens devraient se consacrer, c'est de faire en sorte que ce qui augmente chaque jour les conditions du pire s'arrête. Il faut absolument, absolument fermer les frontières européennes ou en tout cas limiter ceux qui rentrent à une population que nous contrôlons et que nous avons choisie. C'est d'ailleurs une question de souveraineté et tous les pays anglo-saxons ne s'embarrassent pas des débats moraux qui parfois polluent vos débats et les débats politiques en France. Ensuite, il faut se préparer tactiquement au cas où. Il faut toujours espérer le meilleur, mais se préparer au pire. Et plus on est prêt au pire, moins il y a de chances qu'il arrive, puisque ceux qui risquent d'être nos adversaires verront la puissance restaurée de la France et de l'Europe, et donc seront moins enclins à venir s'y frotter. Le dernier point, c'est qu'il faut massivement investir dans l'éducation et la culture pour que les jeunes qui sont nés en Europe et qui y resteront, quelle que soit leur origine et quelle que soit leur culture, apprennent nos racines, apprennent la fierté d'être européens et trouvent dans une aventure collective que nous vivrons enfin unis un dérivé et donc un objectif et un but, une raison de vivre supérieure aux sirènes de la délinquance, de la violence et de l'islamisme qui les attirent dans le chaos. Winston Churchill disait « Il y a 9 repas chauds entre la civilisation et la barbarie. Je pense que nous en avons déjà mangé 1 ou 2. »
Merci beaucoup, monsieur de Montbrial. Je suis d'accord avec vous. Les scènes tournées dans les mairies à travers la France où les extrémistes de gauche du LFI ont pris le contrôle donnent vraiment l'impression d'être un prélude à ceux qui attendent l'Europe de l'Ouest tout entière. Regardez ces vidéos, vraiment. Merci pour cette description très instructive de la situation grave que connaît la France. Et maintenant, mesdames, messieurs, c'est l'heure de quelque chose d'autre. C'est l'heure de la pause café. 15 minutes. Merci. We have no time to lose. So without further ado, I will introduce to you Dr. Ralph Schoellhammer. He's a lecturer, commentator, and podcaster. He caught my attention when he was on GB News talking about Europe being in a pre-revolutionary phase, reminiscent of 1848. Maybe you will reference other revolutions as well during your lecture here. We are all looking forward to it, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Okay, this is the most embarrassing question always. Is this on? Okay, good. Thank you. First, I have to apologize immediately to the interpreters. I made some switches to my speech, and originally I was thinking about holding it in German, but I thought speaking about war in Europe in German might be too much of an omen. So I stuck to English, and I put it upon me to bring a little bit, as much as this is possible with the topic, a little bit of an optimistic view to it. So I agree with many of the things, actually most of the things, particularly that David has said. Although I think before the unrest or the civil war-like scenario will emerge, I think we are closer to a revolutionary scenario. Now, revolutions are interesting, particularly in historical hindsight, because very often we like to see them as a reaction to the great shift in politics, kind of about the revolutions are about the great questions. And that is true, right? That is something that's lurking in the background. But I would like to remind everyone that kind of the trigger or what's the spark that ignites a revolution is sometimes much more mundane. So when we think about the French Revolution, the storm of the Bastille, now what many people don't know, as a critic of green policies, I'm particularly interested in climate change. And it is an unknown or a barely known fact that the winter of 1788 was the coldest winter in France in 300 years. So they had a terrible harvest. So there was a massive problem with hunger in France in the year 1789. So the conditions for revolution were there, but the spark ultimately, or part of the spark, was hunger. There was a massive financial crisis in France because the French decided in 1776 to support the American Revolutionary War. Surely, from a moral perspective, a wonderful idea. The problem, however, was ultimately they ran out of money. So they wanted to increase taxes. Just like today, nobody really liked that idea either. So if you have inflation and the threat of higher taxes, you create the very conditions for potentially revolutionary outbreaks. I think in some, if not all, in some European countries, we're currently moving in a similar direction. I was reading the news this morning, and apparently in Germany, there are now new ideas about additional taxes. There are ideas that spouses can no longer be health insured with their husband or with their wife. So that's an increase, so to speak, in the tax burden. At the same time, however, I just read the news a couple of minutes ago, apparently due to attacks on Russian energy infrastructure, Russian export capacity at the worst could be reduced by 40%. So with the closure in the Strait of Hormuz and Russia being taken off, or at least 40% of Russia's energy being taken off the market, you're going to have massive inflation coming towards us in the next couple of weeks. This is something that will not be preventable. So you have conditions and situations very similar to the things that happened in 1788, 1789. Another revolution, very famous, 1917. People think about October, right? Lenin, the October Revolution. What many people do not talk about is the February Revolution of 1917, which was triggered under the slogan, bread and peace. So this is, as I understand, like for those who live in the higher echelons of society, mundane topics like the electricity bill or the price of bread might seem like, a topic that is fairly far away, that does not impact us directly, but a significant part of the population is directly impacted by it. So I think these pre-revolutionary conditions are actually coming into shape more and more. Now, as human beings, we have a tendency to look to the past and try to extrapolate the future. So if things went well for the last 30 years or the last 40 years or the last 50 years, we assume that the future will remain the same. But I would like to remind everybody that in 1988, if you would have taken a poll and said, well, do you think that the Soviet Union will be gone in 1992? I guess most people would have said no, or they would have declared you clinically insane. Now, as we know, this is precisely what happened. If you would have asked anybody in 1913 that the entire world they grew up in will be gone 5 years later, everybody would have said you're crazy. And yet these things do happen. We very often, for political reasons, hear comparisons with the 1930s. This is kind of the thing that always is on the horizon. It's, the Nazis return, fascism. It's the usual thing that we hear. But I believe that the comparison with 1917 and with 1788 is a much, much more appropriate one. Europe, as I said, or at least some parts of Europe, are currently moving into the same direction. What holds many countries still together, I think Germany is a case of this, I think the French are a case of this, and I think many other nations as well, is the welfare state. It is no longer social solidarity built on nationalism or identity. It's built on an economic interest. And to be very clear, for a long time, this was not a bug, it was a feature. The dream of the postmodern, if you want, the postmodern neoliberal world was one where we would all cooperate out of economic interest. You don't like your neighbor because he speaks your language, he shares your culture, he has similar tastes as you do. You like your neighbor because you do business. And if he's better off economically, if you are better off economically, there will be no reason to fight anymore. This was very much the idea early on in the European Union. And to a certain extent, this was also the idea underlying globalization. Now, the problem with this is this works until there's a crisis. Because what happens if this economic arrangement is no longer working? What then would persuade me to show solidarity, to show loyalty to my neighbor or anybody else? So in a sense, For those of us who like to watch old Italian movies, or I think when we talk about Ireland, there's something like the Irish Mafia as well, right? I'm sure you know these movies where there's a shop owner and then some shady figure comes into the shop and says, nice shop you have here. Would be tragic if something happens to it. That's a little bit how the current welfare state is functioning. That everybody knows, and for example, in Austria, where I'm from, this is openly admitted, that the reason why we can't change or reform the welfare state is because if we would do this, everybody would turn to crime. Now, first of all, the assumption that your population are basically all criminals that don't turn to crime if you don't pay them enough, I think shows you a little bit kind of how high the opinion of the ruling classes of the people. But it is partially true, especially for the part of the population that does not feel any kind of loyalty to your country, that does not feel it's part of the history, and therefore has no interest in continuing its history. Again, Germany is just a good example because it offers itself for some cheap jokes. I mean, no disrespect. I love the Germans very much. So when I do this, it comes from a place of affection, not from a place of malice. But I just found it entertaining that I think they have now reformed it, the so-called citizens' money, the Bürgergeld. But if you looked at the statistics, 51% of the recipients of the citizens' money were actually non-citizens. So if they would have been honest, they should have called it the non-citizen money, at least to be more honest about this. Now, before I move on, kind of with a little bit of my kind of historical path, I'd like to provide you with an argument that I think is very crucial and will help us in the struggles ahead. We consider ourselves conservatives, patriots, nationalists, whatever term you use. But sometimes I feel that this only tells half the story. Everybody understands and nobody denies that societies are evolving. Nobody denies that Germany, France, Austria, Ireland today is different than it was 20 years ago, than it was 40 years ago, than it was 100 years ago. But there's a difference between what happened 200 years ago and what happens now. Societies undergo evolutions. What we are currently experiencing is a transformation that nobody was ever asked if they want this. Think about it this way. I'm now in my early 40s. I know I look significantly younger. I appreciate all the compliments. I'm in my early 30s, so I'm completely different than I was 10 years ago, and I'm even way more different than I was 20 years ago. But for my parents, for my siblings, and pretty much for all my friends, I'm still the same good old Ralph that I've ever been, and that is true. I evolved, I grew, I changed, some ways in a better ways, in some ways in a worse way, but it's still distinctively me. And the difference what we see in Europe is that our societies are no longer evolving, they are being transformed. And this is what causes many people, justifiably so, this enormous and immense discomfort. That they say, yeah, we understand when people say, oh, your society is changing. Why can't you get with the program? But it's not an evolution. And the left is very good in telling us, oh, this is just the natural course of things. Your societies are changing. It happened always in history. That is true. But what we, as I said, experience now is not an evolution. It is a transformation. And this, I believe, is going to be one aspect what this entire revolution is going to be about, that people don't want this transformation. It is just at the moment that out of economic interest, and I'm exactly the same, as long as life is still as good as it was yesterday or the year before, it hasn't really got much worse. Yes, prices are up, energy is more expensive. I'm a horrible driver, so I haven't driven in 26 years, but I hear that people still do it. So for them, right, their gas prices go up. So it's uncomfortable, but not yet to the level that you say you go out in the streets and protest. But I think we are very, very close to this happening, because I give you a concrete example. There is a sense that one of the biggest promises of Western civilization, if you want, of the modern Western project, was the concept of social mobility, that you could start at the bottom, but you could work your way up. But there were certain conditions that needed to be in place. And one of them was especially access to education, access to a high quality education. Now, let me give you a concrete example. There is a school in the second largest city of Austria, in Graz. In this school, out of 160 pupils, only 5 have German as their mother tongue, and the other 155 do not. The headmaster of this school only goes to Teacher Parents' Day with a bodyguard. They took the janitor and kind of give him a double function as being the bodyguard and the janitor. So I guess he's armed with a broom. I don't know. But this shows you the conditions that have come. And while these stories are tragic on their own, what this means is that those 5 Austrian kids, they will not get a good education, right? Even if the security situation, all of this would not be the case, the fact that teachers cannot teach because they have to take care of those who don't speak the language, right, means that this access to social mobility is taken away from them. And what you see now, slowly but gradually, is that this discomfort that was originally on the, let's say, on the right fringe, is coming to the center, is coming to the middle. So I think what is very important for us to do here and for you as politicians, that while many people have the correct gut feeling, they feel what's going on, they lack the vocabulary, they lack the ability to speak about it. Not because they're stupid, simply because they have other things that occupy their lives, right? Because they go to work every day, they work 40, 50 hours a week, they do not have the time then to say, and now let me read the newest paper about, civil war in Europe, or let me listen to Ralph on GB News. No, because they have, and they should have, they have families, they have things to take care of. But what we have to do is to give them the vocabulary, give them the ability to talk about these things, and also to explain and to make clear to those who downplay the risk, which is that you can survive an economic crisis if at least you still have the comforts of culture. And what I mean by this is that you say, you know what, we are in this together. The situation is hard, this is difficult, but it's us. We're going to power through. And if you look, now I can say something positive about Germany, which I'm very happy about. A country can survive almost everything. You can lose 2 world wars and still become the world's 2nd or 3rd largest economy, if you have the actual people. The great legend that we are very often told is that there is something resembling magic soil. So you come from somewhere, you step foot on Europe, and all of a sudden you're just as European as all these people who have been here for generations. And again, that's a beautiful dream. And if it would be true, I would be the first one to say, sign me up for this. But of course, it is not true. At the end of the day, a country is its people. And if we want Germany, Austria, France, and the UK to be more than just a name on a map, right? What needs to be preserved is the people that made these countries. As I said, yes, they will be different than they were 200 years ago, but they will still be recognizably German. They will still be recognizably Italian. They will still be recognizably French. Now, I consider myself a nationalist. I know this is a very dirty word, but let me tell you what I mean by this. This is at least the way how I explain it, because the argument you very often hear is that people say, oh, you're a nationalist, so you hate everybody else. This is about as stupid as saying, I love my mother, and then somebody says, oh, you hate everybody else's mother. On the contrary, because I love my nation, my country, and my culture, I understand if others love theirs as well. And I think the world is going to be a worse place without Italians. It's going to be a worse place without the French. It's going to be a worse place without the English. And dare I say, it's also going to be a worse place without the Irish. So this is what we, again, the argument is, right, the true multiculturalists are actually the nationalists, because we understand that cultures are different. And that makes them interesting. That makes them worth preserving. That makes the world an interesting and exciting place. Once again, the great lie is that on the one hand, we are told to be more diverse. And if we say, well, this diversity doesn't really work, we are told, what are you talking about? We're all the same. So which one is it? So there's a direct conflict with reality. Like the argument that is being made by the other side is not even internally logically coherent. Sorry, I have to speak slower. And once I'm getting worked up, it's very difficult. Now, that being said, there's just one more point I really want to make, because this is something we have not talked about as much so far, which is that we are in a multicultural society, and I think there are 3 distinct cultures that are in conflict. And I, for lack of a better kind of framework, I like to define them as pre-modern cultures, modern cultures, and postmodern cultures. And in my opinion, right, these 3 cultures cannot peacefully coexist, and it is the clash between those 3 that is tearing Western civilization apart from within. The pre-modern cultures are organized around kinship, pride, tribe, and clan. And I want to give a concrete example. I'm sure some of you have followed the events in Minneapolis, in Minnesota, in the United States. Now, what I found very interesting, there was a mayoral election. And there was a significant chance that a candidate with a Somali background was going to win this election. Ultimately, he lost. Now, it turned out the reason why he lost was not because the Somalis did not vote for him. It was because he was from the wrong tribe of Somalis. So people say, no, because for them, the very concept of simply being Somali does not exist. You might be a Somali, but what's more important is from which tribe are you? And this is what we see in more and more places in the West. Now, we talked before about the growth of organized crime. Again, this is something that is arranged and organized around family structures. There was, when Der Spiegel, a German weekly newspaper, still was something you could actually read, and they did actual investigative reporting. A couple of years ago, they had a wonderful is the wrong term, they had an interesting investigative piece about the clans in Berlin. And there's its organized crime that directly overlaps with clan and family structures. Because for many of those people, and I don't begrudge them that, but it has no place in our societies. Listen, if the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, if they want to be organized along family lines, be my guest, good for them, but it's not working in our societies. The loyalty, if you want, in a modern Western state is supposed to be to your nation. And this is another, I think, very important argumentative tool for you, that the nationalists are not the reactionaries, they're actually the moderns. The modern world as we know it was built on the concept of nationalism. A meritocratic society is only possible if you can pick the best from your society and it doesn't matter to you whether or not that person is your brother, your cousin, or whatever. But if we say, no, actually, it's enough if we are from the same country, if we speak the same language, if we share the same culture. And now comes the third group. I'm sure we're going to talk about this in greater detail, but this is something we must not forget. So we got the pre-moderns, they come mainly via migration. Then we got the moderns, which I would say is us. And then we got the post-moderns. And that is what I would define as the modern left. And what we experience at the moment is an alliance between the pre-moderns and the post-moderns. Because they don't have any allegiance to the nation. They don't have any allegiance to history. They don't like the great narrative. They mock the great narrative. They think it's ridiculous, which is why they deface a statue of Winston Churchill in the UK, which is why they say that Christopher Columbus was terrible, which is why they want to rename every street with every historical figure, why you cannot admire Frederick the Great or Joseph II or you name it, by the very idea that there might have been great men and women in history is something they reject, because that means there could be role models. That means that your nation and your country could be more than just an endless flow of history with no meaning. And I deliberately said men and women, because as an Austrian, I'm very fond of Marie-Therese. I'm very fond of Queen Victoria. I'm very fond of Elizabeth I. So there's even not a gender gap in this respect. And I think this is something we cannot ignore, because we talked about organized crime. If the streets are controlled by the pre-moderns, but media, culture, and the universities are controlled by the post-moderns, then what exactly is left for us? I want to conclude with this one, what I consider biggest mistakes that was done by the right in the past, and we must not repeat this mistake. There was the very strong belief that whenever there is an election, as long as people vote for the right-wing party, that's it. So we need to focus on politics. That's everything that matters. So we ignored culture. We ignored the universities. We ignored the media. We ignored everything that shapes the next generation, that shapes young people, that shapes the very waters in which we swim. And all of a sudden, and I can just recommend everybody does it, viewpoints and opinions that were completely mainstream 40, 60 years ago make you a neo-Nazi, right-wing, crazy fascist today. But this is not because the positions are all of a sudden crazy. It is because the general societal sentiment, to use another beautiful German term, the Zeitgeist, has shifted so far to the left that what was completely normal 40 years ago is considered crazy today. And this is the struggle. This is the fight that we also have to engage. But in order to do this, we have to be clear about our terms. Right? If somebody says, why are you a patriot? You have to be able to tell them why. Why are you a nationalist? You have to be able to tell them why. And I think there are plenty of reasons. Because, and this is truly my last point, I'm a member of the McDonald's club, right? You know, if you're a member of this and you buy lots of cheeseburgers, you get like every 10th cheeseburger for free, which works very well with my favorite diet. But if McDonald's would call me and say, Ralph, we are going to war with Burger King, and you're part of the McDonald's army, I most likely would say, no, thank you. I really like my membership for the free burgers, but that's it. And in a certain way, we started to treat citizenship like my McDonald's membership. That you hold a passport, it's just a piece of paper. It gives you access to the welfare state. It gives you access to the educational system. But it's just rights and no longer any obligations. And the concept, once again, that the moderns understood, that Immanuel Kant understood, that every right needs to have a corresponding obligation. We no longer do this. We only talk about rights. We no longer talk about duties. The word duty per se has become a dirty word. Is that me? Okay. And this is kind of what we get back to, that it is a privilege to be a member of a certain country. It is a privilege to be part of a nation. And it is something worthwhile defending, which brings me to the point I made before, because then very often people will say, well, but Ralph, it's just a coincidence that you were born in Austria, so why should you care? For the very same reason that it was coincidence that I'm my parents' son and my brother's sibling, and yet I still love them. I would never go to my brother and say, you know what, I decided I no longer care about you because it's pure coincidence that we are brothers. That would be insane. No sane person would do this, but we have been taught, educated, and marinated or brainwashed in doing that with our nation. Of course my own nation is close to me. Of course I care about it. Was it coincidence I was born there? Yes. But you know what? Even if so, that makes it even more an obligation to make sure that future generations, if they coincidentally happen to be born in my country, can have the same luxury, can enjoy the same privileges, and of course also the same obligations that I had. So again, don't be ashamed, don't be afraid. It's worthwhile to fight for your country, it's worthwhile to fight for civilization, and if it takes a revolution to maintain it, I'm going to be completely honest. 20 years ago, 10 years ago, I would have said, I'd dread the revolution. If it's necessary, it cannot come quickly enough. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ralph. This was also very, very interesting, and it reminds me of a book by the author Yoram Hassoni on national conservatism and the nation state. That the nation state is in fact a very real accomplishment by humanity. Moving away from the pre-modern societies of clans, tribes, kin, but also avoiding a top-down structure of empire. So it really is in accordance with the ways in which we can actually organize democracies. So that is something that we should continue to discuss and to debate. And thank you so much for these thought-provoking remarks of yours, very relevant remarks. So the last speaker is Dr. Eoin Lenihan, Irish journalist and researcher, and Ireland has been named as potentially the first country in which civil strife could break out. And in some ways, you already see those tendencies. But we're very curious to hear what you have to say. So, Dr. Lenihan, the floor is yours.
So, good evening. It's an honor to be here. And as we started with Professor Betz, he said that he believes Ireland will be the first country to go to full civil war. So maybe I can give you a sense of some of the dynamics that might prove him correct in the end. So let me begin with a story. 9 days before Christmas in 2023, fire services were scrambled to Killigill House in the pastoral village of Roscahill in Connemara. It's a beautiful tourism spot in the west of Ireland. It was built in 1863 by an Anglo-Irish landlord, and the historic house was set ablaze after more than a week of protests, which saw locals barricade roadways to the house with felled trees, tractors, and so on. Word had spread throughout the village, close-knit community of 300 people, that 70 immigrant men of unknown origins were to be placed in a disused hotel under the government's International Protection Accommodation Scheme, IPAS. The next day, after the fire, Ireland's Deputy Prime Minister, Micheál Martin, denounced the burning. He tweeted out, quote, "There is never any excuse or place for violence, hatred, or intimidation. Those responsible for this criminal act do not speak for their community or the country." The Prime Minister at the time, Leo Varadkar, added, quote, "There is no justification for violence, arson, or vandalism in our republic, ever." Now, as defiant as Varadkar and Martin were in the wake of this Killigill House burning, a simple fact remained. Killigill House had survived the ravages of the Irish War of Independence and the Irish Civil War, which saw 300 Anglo-Irish landlord houses burnt out. But it couldn't survive the first coalition government of Ireland's self-proclaimed centrist parties. And the idea with this fire, the idea that the Republic of Ireland could be plunged into a civil war was, for the first time in a century, a very real and distinct possibility, certainly for the first time in my life. So how do we get to this point? As of August 2024, there were at least 31 fires at proposed or rumoured IPAS centres across Ireland. The most of these were in Dublin. with the majority of the fires reported between 2023 and mid-2024. The escalation in arson at these sites was matched by the state in their use of violence to put down demonstrations close to centres. Tensions flared because the government enacted a no consultation and no veto policy of forcing large groups of mainly Arab and African men claiming refugee status into historic close-knit communities. Communities were left with no legal recourse, and it was not uncommon for buses of immigrants to arrive in the middle of the night and for communities to wake up with their demographics completely and utterly changed. The totalitarian and utterly undemocratic actions of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael backed locals into a corner. And in some cases, that resulted in those locals taking desperate actions. Sadly, what ended up as a fiery standoff between the people and the state had begun as a touching moment of solidarity. In 2022, the Irish government offered the most generous social benefits in the EU to Ukrainians who are fleeing the war with Russia. For example, refugees were given a weekly stipend of €232 with accommodation and other benefits, which was the same as the job seekers' rate for unemployed Irish people. Now, in comparison, Hungary offered €13.79 per week. Because of this extraordinarily generous offer, by January 2024, Ireland had welcomed more than 100,000 Ukrainian refugees fleeing the conflict. And we were accepting them at a rate 10 times the EU average throughout 2023. To accommodate these staggering numbers for a small island like Ireland, the state's apparatus or accommodation capabilities were completely overwhelmed. And so the government offered eye-wateringly lucrative contracts to private hoteliers to put these refugees up. Placing the refugees in hotels had a dramatic effect on communities along the western seaboard, where I come from, who are disproportionately dependent upon tourism for economic survival. As of February 2024, all of the top 10 towns or villages with the most Ukrainian refugees in Ireland were located in the western seaboard. The Irish Tourism Industry Confederation in 2022, at the end of 2022, estimated that 28% of all tourism beds outside of Dublin had been contracted by the government to house Ukrainians. And that same organisation estimated that €1 billion would be lost to the Irish tourism sector in 2023, which it was, and again in 2024. The extraordinary sums of money that were given to private hoteliers were such that by May 2024, a local paper, the Clare Echo, reported that private individuals were buying up properties in North Clare with the express interest of leasing them out to the government to the detriment to the wider local economy. When the government offered vast sums of tourism accommodation to tourism accommodation providers to give beds to asylum seekers, not only did they make those providers unimaginably wealthy overnight, but they deprived non-accommodation tourism providers of paying customers, thus killing the wider industry. And this put unimaginable financial strain on people in towns like Lisdoonvarna in my home county, where the economy is largely based around summer tourism, like food, drink, entertainment, sightseeing, and shopping, so on. These were completely killed. It created an entirely new class system also, with pockets of extreme wealth and extreme subsistence overnight. The dual shock of losing your livelihood and seeing accommodation providers, former neighbours, made arbitrarily wealthy, unimaginably wealthy, is a recipe for disaster and conflict in small communities. This was a pattern that had emerged across the country as a new class of hoteliers had become extremely powerful. And all of this at the expense of the Irish taxpayer. In total, €2.1 billion was paid out to IPAS accommodation in 2023 alone. In May of 2023, the Irish Times, a national newspaper, reported that the government policy of using tourism accommodation to house refugees had cost 10,000 tourism jobs nationwide to that point. Clare's biggest town, again my home county, Ennis, had lost 15.4 million in tourism income and 415 jobs. World famous Killarney, the jewel in the crown of Irish tourism, home to 2,575 Ukrainians, lost 100 million and 2,722 jobs. That's nearly as many Irish tourism jobs displaced as there were Ukrainians coming into the west of Ireland. Now, this isn't an attack on the Ukrainians, far from it. Despite the extraordinary sacrifices and the devastation to local tourism economies, Irish people were actually largely supportive of these measures. It was Ireland's Wearschaffen das moment. However, what started out with the best of intentions and a sense of national unity turned sour when locals realised that the Ukrainians were being cycled out of the private accommodation market, and the hotels, which were promised to return to the communities along with their livelihoods, were not returned. Instead, Arab and African men were cycled in. And with this change in policy came a strengthening in tone of no veto, no consultation from the state. And international protection centres began to burn. But this was a spark 20 years in the making. Ireland's Celtic Tiger boom, economic boom at the turn of the millennium, coincided with an explosion in bogus asylum claims, largely from Nigeria and other African nations. As early as 2005, Ireland's Justice Minister, Michael McDowell, admitted that 90% of asylum claims to that point were unfounded or fake. Yet no mass state-supervised deportations followed. By not deporting those who arrived into Ireland at the beginning of the millennium, the government set a precedent. Ireland was marked out as a soft touch, and fake asylum claims have risen exponentially over the past 25 years. So in 2017, there were just under 3,000 asylum claims in tiny Ireland, 4 million people in 2005. By 2023, there were more than 13,000. Absurdly, under political pressure in 2025, current Prime Minister Micheál Martin stated that in 2024, 65% of asylum applications were rejected in the first instance. This would rise significantly later on. And in January 2025, 80% of asylum applications were rejected. Again, no mass deportations have followed. Martin, the leader of the country, threw up his hands as though he and his party weren't responsible for this mess. And it is a mess. For 2 decades, successive Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael governments have claimed that Ireland's asylum system has been under control and that everyone entering the country was well vetted using fingerprinting and EU database cross-checking. This was exposed as a lie in January 2024 when Ireland's then Justice Minister Helen McEntee was confronted about her department's de facto open borders politics by several independent politicians. When she was pressed to make a statement on the verification process of asylum applications, she said, quote, this is our Justice Minister. As a first step, all applicants are photographed and fingerprinted. These fingerprints are then checked against the Eurodac database. And many of you will know Eurodac is an EU-wide immigration database which stores the fingerprints of asylum applicants, so they can be cross-checked to see who has crossed borders illegally. However, one of the few investigative journalists in Ireland, Niamh Bhríon, followed up on the Justice Minister's claim and found that between 2015 and 2023, no Irish authority had ever accessed Eurodac for the purposes of investigating serious crime. When another independent minister asked how many asylum applicants' fingerprints were checked against Europol, she responded that the Irish police do not input asylum claimants' fingers into Europol. The point is, no meaningful vetting of asylum claimants to Ireland have been performed in the past 20 years. And it gets even worse than that. It further transpired in 2022 and 2023 alone. Nearly 9,000 individuals presented at Dublin Airport seeking asylum with no or falsified documents, with only one case being prosecuted. And in those same years, 2022 and 2023, the majority of asylum claims, 27,000 in total, came from non-EU countries, predominantly Africa. And again, when pushed, the Justice Minister admitted that no meaningful background checks were carried out on non-EU applicants either. Again, to quote her, "It would be in breach of our responsibilities in respect of refugee protection to contact the consular authorities, as doing so may have the consequence of making such authorities aware of an applicant's presence in the state and their claim for international protection." These exchanges simply proved what many Irish had long suspected. Ireland is a de facto open border state. And the masses of single men who have been forced into small, ancient, close-knit communities around Ireland are entirely unvetted and entirely unknown entities. Despite this, successive leaders, beginning with then Prime Minister Leo Varadkar, adopted this ruthless policy of no consultation with local communities and no veto on behalf of the communities when busing these immigrants in with drop-offs, as I said, often happening in the dead of night. Now, these are the circumstances that have led to violent confrontations in towns such as Newtown, Mount Kennedy, where police pepper sprayed and baton charged locals, as well as in Clonmel and Coolock. Most recently, before Christmas, a riot erupted outside of Ireland's largest asylum hotel in Dublin after a 10-year-old girl was allegedly raped by an African asylum seeker on the grounds of the hotel. When an Algerian immigrant stabbed a 3-year-old outside a school in central Dublin in November 2023, it ignited a riot which saw mass civil disobedience, buses and police vehicles set alight, and scenes previously thought unimaginable. And I had certainly witnessed nothing like it in my lifetime. And that particular riot made news headlines around the world. So if Ireland was then to descend into a kinetic civil war or an outpouring of mass civil disobedience, I would say this, Professor Betz, it's undoubtedly that, in my mind, it'll be sparked by the authoritarianism of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael enforcing unknown and unvetted men that they know are making false asylum claims into small, close-knit communities. But there's other simmering issues also. Since the 1960s, the Irish economy has been focused on attracting foreign direct investment, largely from pharmaceutical and tech multinationals from the USA. Up until the mid-1990s, this worked relatively well. And by 1996, Ireland had achieved full employment. Rather than cool international investment at that point, the big two parties, again, self-proclaimed centrist Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, ramped up foreign direct investment. A 12.5% corporation tax, significantly lower than our EU neighbours, was fully implemented in 2003, and that made Ireland an attractive base of operations for US multinationals looking to avoid paying non-US taxes. The demand for jobs skyrocketed, and to meet it, successive governments imported over 1 million people between 2000 and 2025, turning Ireland from one of Europe's most homogenous countries into one in which almost 1/4 of all people are now born overseas, all in the space of just 25 years. So one of the most critical effects this massive population explosion has had has been to lead to the worst housing crisis in the history of the state. At present, 40% of employed, not unemployed, not general, 40% of employed young Irish people between the ages of 20 and 35 live in their parental home. That's in stark contrast. So just to give you an example, in Germany and France, that number is 12% of young people living at home. And in Sweden, it's 2%. So 40% of Irish people are being forced to live at home despite working. As a May 2024 report by Eurofound reported that 61% of all young Irish people between the ages of 15 and 29 were either planning to migrate or wish to migrate to another country within 3 years. This is the highest figure for any EU nation. So Irish young people, more than any other EU nation, want out of their home country. So added to this injustice that young people feel in not being able to afford a home is the fact that the government's poor handling of the FDI economy that is attracting multinationals, which the native population worker pool cannot service, has led to work visas being handed out to highly paid tech and health graduates from non-EU nations, largely India. Official statistics show that Ireland is importing Indians at a rate of about 2,000 per month. Again, tiny Ireland, many of them going into highly paid tech and health jobs. As such, they are able to have their pick of properties in Ireland's urban areas, while working Irish are locked up in their childhood bedrooms. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael have imported a ready-made Indian upper middle class who take up a privileged position in Irish society immediately upon entering the country. They are currently arriving in such numbers that aside from becoming an instant elite in Irish society, they'll feel no pressure to integrate into Irish society because they can form self-sustaining micro-communities. And this is a recipe for resentment and long-term ethnic tensions. At present, there's a growing sense amongst Irish people that government is firmly on the side of immigrants who they need to keep their FDI economic expansion afloat. And as people grow more vocal in their opposition to mass immigration, with polls consistently showing that at least 70% of the population of Ireland want a reduction in immigration, the government responds by clamping down on online speech and supposed hate crimes. So, to get to the point, will the Irish rise up in violent rebellion against the state? Unlikely. And here's why. Ireland has remained docile and passive during the past two, and I should say outside of a spark caused by reckless immigration policies. I'm talking now more long-term, perhaps. Ireland has remained docile and passive during the past 2 decades of change, and the biggest reason for this is immigration. More than 1 million Irish people have left the nation since the foundation of the state. Immigration has always been Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael's emergency relief valve in tough economic times. During the 1950s, after Eamon de Valera's failed protectionist experiment, and again in the 1980s after a failure to adapt to global recession, and again after the collapse of the Celtic Tiger and our bailout by the European Commission, the IMF, and the European Central Bank in 2010, waves of young Irish people left for familiar territory in the UK, Canada, Australia, and America. That exodus of young, virile, and energetic people siphons off the anger that they take with them. The anger at being let down by poor economic management, by Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, the anger of being forced to leave their communities and nation, the anger of being seen as disposable. There cannot be a kinetic civil war in Ireland while its youngest and most virile are forced abroad generation after generation. More importantly, there can also be no systematic change to the political ruling class when those who have been most betrayed by the big two in Irish politics, as well as Sinn Féin, who have offered no political opposition or an alternative vision for Ireland, are forced out of the country where they lose their right to vote and participate in the future of Ireland. Ireland's most energetic, angry, and conscious of the problems facing the nation are forced to either forget Ireland entirely or simmer angrily abroad. For a new Ireland to arise, the most angry must remain. Quite a task for a nation with centuries of emigration encoded into its psyche. As such, there will be, at least in the medium term, there'll be no grand romantic uprising. There'll be no reenactment of 1916. Instead, Ireland will have to endure what the rest of Western Europe has endured for the past number of decades. A steady rise in violent crime, sexual assault and murder, already evident in official data, and a breakdown in high trust communities. As the Irish government has made no effort to break up ethnic and religious groups when forcing them into small communities around the country, Ireland will have to endure inter-ethnic conflict related to drugs, gang, and social and economic discrepancies amongst unintegrated groups and between unintegrated groups and natives. In 25 short years, Ireland has followed the rest of Western Europe in making the same mistakes that they made in their initial waves of immigration policy decades ago. And so Ireland's social collapse, our path out, is linked to how other Western European nations also handle the issue. Step one, in my opinion, must be for Ireland to develop a strong populist right party and identity. What makes Ireland somewhat unique is the narrowness of our political axis, our left-right political axis. While opposition parties like Sinn Féin are explicit and determined socialists, the big two, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, have almost no ideological grounding. They are floating parties who shift to where the EU tells them to shift and where they see votes can be picked up at any given time at home. That ideological vacuousness has pulled them further and further left over the past 2 decades towards those like Sinn Féin with principles. A recently released analysis of party manifestos in Ireland's political parties, how Ireland voted 2024, found that all major parties are left-wing in Ireland, with the editor of that, Professor Eoin O'Malley, stating that Ireland's political landscape was, quote, among Europe's most left-wing. Ireland then needs a populist right party and a movement in the style of Sweden Democrats and her successful cousins in France, in Germany, Hungary, Italy, and elsewhere. Ireland needs to establish a right-wing beachhead in Europe's most left-wing nation. It is the only deterrent against Ireland's social decline and possible descent into civil war.
Thank you so much for those sobering words, Dr. Lenihan. I can imagine few places in Europe with such a lack of real political representation of the electorate as Ireland, maybe Wallonia, where there's no party right of center at all represented in Parliament. And that is indeed a democratic deficit. Now, we are turning towards reflections and questions and answers. So I thought I might as well start. I would like to turn to Professor Betz. Yesterday, the Swedish government and the Sweden Democrats announced a sharp tightening of residence permit rules. From now on, a person's conduct and lifestyle, including links to criminal networks, even without conviction, antisocial behavior, benefit fraud, violent extremism, or organized crime, will be decisive for both granting and revoking permits. Obviously, this is an attempt to remove foreign nationals who threaten public order. Enforcing such a policy requires the state to maintain its monopoly on violence. Given the situation in Britain today, with strong parallel societies and accumulated violence capital in certain immigrant communities in areas like parts of Bradford, districts of Birmingham, Tower Hamlets, where we've seen grooming scandals, riots, and repeated breakdowns in police control, do you believe that any British government could actually implement and sustain measures like these? Or, as you've described in your analysis of feral cities and negotiated areas of police control in urban enclaves, will the state simply lose effective control in those zones and be unable to project power there?
I think it's the latter. If I'm honest, why wouldn't I be honest? So I think it's the latter. I don't think that any of the established parties have any intention or capability of doing the things that you've described. For a while, I think people invested a great deal of hope in the possibility that Reform might be a party which would do such things, but I think you'd have to be extremely naive to believe that still. There is some question, of course, around the new movement under Rupert Lowe's Restore movement, whether it can perform that role. Certainly, if you were simply to judge on the basis of the things that Rupert Lowe says and his own personal performance, I think that would give you some, might give you some reason to think that it's possible. I rather suspect, though, it's probably too late for him to win, to organize to win the next election. I hope that's not the case, but I do have that feeling. And then also you have a different problem. Even if you get said government with this intention and the right ideas and the right people to implement it, you will have to fight the bureaucracy, which I imagine, which has considerable legal powers to subvert governments, to sabotage ministers, to wrap any government which attempted to play by the rules in so much regulation that they wouldn't get anything done. So I'm not hopeful. I think that the speed of politics in the UK is something like that of a London bus, and the speed of events is accelerating like an F-35 fighter jet off the deck of a US aircraft carrier. These things are not, so the problems are accelerating much more rapidly than I think there is potential in the existing political system to catch up, which ultimately leads to breakdown and all the things I've suggested and other panelists have mentioned.
So we have a question from one of the attending MEPs, Mr. Fernand Kartheiser.
Thank you very much. And I actually have a question to Dr. Betz and maybe also to Dr. Schoellhammer. The Marion Maréchal in her introduction said that nowadays the civilization and the nationality are two different categories, but the armed services and the police, they recruit not on basis of civilization, but on basis of nationality. So the question may be, what is the composition nowadays of the armed forces or security forces in Europe, and how reliable would they be in case of, for instance, a conflict based on ethical reasons? So are there any studies on the composition of our security forces? And maybe also for Dr. Schoellhammer, I don't know whether we have still the force to be revolutionaries. I think you need young societies probably to be revolutionary, but there might be an additional reason, and that is if you want to be revolutionary, and that is the mass surveillance, the repression that is now more and more visible, and maybe also the fact that democracy is violated because the electoral results are either falsified or annulled if they are not taken into account properly, or they try to make a detour around the democracy, like in Germany with the Brandmauer, or that we also see here in the European Parliament, so that even if people vote for a certain kind of political parties, that their wish is simply not being taken into account. And there might be a dissatisfaction with the betrayal of democracy. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. So the loyalty of the military, that is an excellent question. Hard to answer, but it seems to me, or to answer with any sort of precision, but I think some important things, for example, the open letter signed by a large number of retired French generals and many other military officers some years ago warning of civil war was a pretty good signal, I think, that of the mood of the professional military in that country. In Germany, there have been open fears since 2017 about right-wing radicalization in military and police, particularly in the top tier military units. I'm sure probably Ralph knows more about that than I see a few people nodding in the room, actually, so it's not exactly new information I'm saying. In Britain, I think the authorities are much more circumspect on this, but there has been a certain amount of expressed anxiety, both at the within the ministry by uniformed officials, but also by ministers about perceived radicalization of service members. I think it's very important, and Britain's the case I know best, and I think it's very important that British Army's DNA is the regimental system is practically it's fundamentally rooted in local identity, which is why during the Northern Ireland Troubles, the army took care not to deploy Irish regiments into Northern Ireland. And I think that I think there are good reasons to be cautious. If you are kind of have the expectation that the army is going to be rock solid in support of the crown, I think you should maybe revisit that idea. I don't want to over dramatize the thing. There isn't the coup d'etat is not part of the British military's tradition, its métier, and I don't mean to suggest that it is, but it is comprised of people. It is an organization which is very rooted locally, and as all armies, has a very strong national ethos. Its rank and file is very clearly generated from communities who are the most anxious about the things that have been discussed. And so for all these reasons, I think if I was sitting in cabinet in any one of the countries discussed this afternoon, I would be very cautious about assuming that that lever of power was actually one that you could pull with expectation that it would work to your benefit. It might just do nothing. That would be my strong suspicion, is that it would probably back out.
This is a fantastic question. I'm very glad that the answer is, and I have a twofold reply to it. And I'm very happy you brought it up. One is, it depends on the kind of the military. If it's a professional military, I would argue you have some kind of self-selection. So usually only people who have a certain nationalist sentiment or affinity for their country would join a voluntary military, a professional military. With conscription, given the demographic trends, it would be different. However, I think what then could come into place, I think it was Lenin who once said that if the Germans want to storm a train station, they first buy a ticket. But I think there is another historical parallel that offers itself. When we talk about the end of the Soviet Union, right, it was not, or for the most part, not mass revolution, but one key ingredient, something that David and I talked about earlier this day, was after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and kind of once you had the first casualties, it was particularly mothers in Moscow and St. Petersburg who kind of mobilized against the government. So if you would have a situation, let's say in Germany or Austria, where you have migration into the welfare state, but the actual, native, so to speak, men have to go to the military and potentially to war, I don't think it would take many casualties for this very crucial mass, women over 40, or the mothers, basically, for them to say, this is no longer working for us. I think this is, when it comes, not every revolution is different from another. So there's the kind of the French kind which is different. But I think in Europe, it would be carried by the middle class, and probably parts of the middle class that are over 40. I completely agree with you. It would not be the young people. But if we just run the pure numbers, there are still enough young people around as well. And if I'm a young man, as I described it before, I'm 18 years old, I go to a school where I'm the only person that is actually still Austrian. And then they tell me, the one guy who has a bad school, nobody speaks my language, and they say, you don't have to go to the front while the other guys can stay here because they don't have an Austrian passport. I think this is how you create, or even further, the potential revolutionary sentiment. So I think in a sense, what's happening in Germany could accelerate this trend, because then you actually do demand an obligation, a duty from the people. And then you can no longer say, oh, we're all the same, because some have to serve, others don't. And if this divide then also happens to overlap with, well, those who don't are the non-passport holders, but the majority of the welfare state recipients, then I think this sense of unfairness and disproportionality, I think, will make, however then it will play out, but like the quasi-revolutionary sentiment even more likely.
Christine Anderson.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie, and Marion for organizing this event. It was very enlightening, I have to say. I especially liked the report of Mr. Schoellhammer. It was so refreshing to hear you just come out and say, yes, I'm a nationalist, so what? And explaining it's because I love my country. That doesn't mean I hate other countries. Exactly. But also your analogy, it doesn't mean if I say I love my mother, to say I love my mother doesn't mean I hate all other mothers. I usually make it even more impactful by saying, how can you fault a mother for loving her own children more than other children? No, of course not. If that weren't the case, then we would have been extinct a long time ago. If the mothers didn't love their own children more than any other children, that doesn't mean that she hates other children. But if it comes to her kids, they come first, point blank. So having said that, I'm a little, I mean, it's rather, tragic to hear, about all this. We kind of all know what's coming. So what I'm really interested in, or what I would like to know your perspective on that. So we have societies, and you pointed that out. The people have no democratic recourse anymore. They aren't being asked. They're just, being dealt whatever blow. So if, especially in a democracy, if the people are left with no democratic recourse, so if elections no longer bring about change, what are the people actually left with? So in essence, the only way they are left with would be to rebel and somehow erupt in a civil war. However, at this point, I kind of fail to see that happening. What I see happening is more along the lines, considering that we have imported millions and millions and millions of people. To them, it's not about having a green or a blue or a yellow jacket. It's about having the jacket at all. Meaning they will take whatever they think is coming to them, they will take it by force. So as long as we as societies are still somewhat managing to keeping them satisfied, feed them, clothe them, do whatever, but once that breaks away, and given the situation, inflation, it was all outlined, energy prices are exploding, costs of living are rising. Once our societies and taxpayer base breaks away, once we are no longer capable of keeping them somewhat happy, clothed, fed, whatever, I see them erupting, taking what is theirs. And we also, I think, might have a historic example in former Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was only capable of functioning with the different ethnic groups and, all pressed together because it was a strong, authoritarian, totalitarian state. So is that the ultimate goal of what they're trying to achieve here? Flood the countries with these all kinds of foreigners? That they have to erect this authoritarian, totalitarian state. So I would really like to kind of pick your brains on that, how you see that evolving and coming about. Thank you.
To your first point, I think Ireland provides a very timely answer to what happens when the government does act with impunity, when you do push the citizens back to the wall and you give them no out. So I would say that in Ireland now, there's a very clear understanding, a very clear line has been drawn just around this one area. This is the area that has the greatest potential for explosiveness, for immediate civil unrest. And the line is very, very clear now. That Rubicon has been crossed, that we now know what will happen if the government around this area of migration does continue to force unvetted males into small communities. We've seen the pattern repeated over 31 times. So I think that's our new baseline in this specific niche. And then, of course, we're talking then wider multiple factors in a medium to long-term societal breakdown, which is another more complex question. But I think we could take from the Irish context that this is now the new rules. If you push people's backs to the wall, if you act in an authoritarian manner, many people will feel that they're justified, that they have no other recourse but to resort to violence. And it just, to me, shows up, you know, we do live in an absurd time. We do live in a very odd time where governments have been emboldened to steamroll through like this. They don't feel any in Ireland, and I think it's fair to say in what we've heard today in other European countries as well, there is no sense that the government works for the people. There's very much a sense that you're going to get with our agenda and our program, or we're going to drive out over you. And when you employ this is the absurdity of parties like SPD, CDU, or Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, claiming to be the sensible middle ground. This is such an anti-democratic, extremist position to take, anti-democratic position to take, and yet it's somehow normalized. But a line has been drawn in the Irish context.
Just a very quick point. I agree with everything, but one which is very difficult for me because I don't want to say it, but there is, of course, a little bit of a problem with the people as well. What I mean by this is Austria is a bit of an exception. If you believe current polls, that it looks like the Freedom Party is up to 38-40%. So that gets close to actually having a majority. But if you look at other countries, it very often is the case that the positions and the things we discuss here, I believe that if you would put them into a questionnaire and put it to the people, 80% would agree. But then they go to the elections, and as Eoin said, then they vote for the SPD, the CDU, because no, this one time I'm sure that now they have seen the error of their ways, and now they will do it differently. And this is a bit the problem. I believe this is then also a matter of how to campaign. And at the end of the day, we're moving closer and closer, where people have a binary choice. So you can either vote for the terrifying right that is willing to actually turn the ship around, or you vote for the parties that say full head of steam into the iceberg. And I think this has to be the argument. The reason why I support whether it's the Sweden Democrats or whether it's the AFD or the FPÖ is not necessarily because I agree 100% with all their positions, but it is they are parties that want to operate within the existing system. Right? They want to operate within a democracy. If they fail, a term that I learned from you, David, at some point you will have an expectation gap where people will say, if you cannot, like if these parties are either never allowed to be in power, or if when they are in power, they get sabotaged and they cannot actually change anything, at some point, 60% of the people will say, you know what, this whole democracy is not working for me. Let's try something completely different. So if I would run a campaign for these parties, I would say, listen, we are not the threat to democracy. We are the last thing that separates democracy from whatever then comes afterwards.
Very quickly, I agree with what was said there, so I don't need to repeat my version of it. But I would add one element, which is that theory would suggest that from the government perspective, there is an incentive to accelerate migration at this point, because there is a kind of paradoxical stability that comes from a very fractured society where no single group has the ability to form a mass movement. I don't think that that's going to work. I think our situation is one where people became aware of what was happening earlier than would have been, if you look at it from the opposite side, would have been preferable. And as a result of which, you can sense people are waking up, they're seeing what is happening, and that now is then powering this sense of urgency, which we've heard a few times already, about that something has to be done, and it really has to be done now. So bottom line is, I can say it's perfectly plausible from from a kind of cynical Machiavellian governmental perspective to say, okay, this situation is so dangerous, we need to put the pedal to the metal on migration so that these people can, there's no way it can possibly be changed and you simply accept. But I don't think that's going to work at this stage. It happened too early, and there were too many signals in terms of, well, many mentioned terror attacks, of course, and it must be said that the rape gangs just enormously important in that. It woke a lot of people up to a vision of the future that is all too plausible and that they desperately do not want. And I think when you're back, that is a good example of feeling you're back to the wall, stuck between a situation of doing nothing or simply accepting the absolutely intolerable. And people are getting there, and I think quick.
All what was said leads to the lose of confidence in the system by the population. So first they lose confidence, they lose trust in the politicians and eventually in the institutions. So this is going on in France, more slowly or not, depending on the situations. And I have two quick examples. One, last year we made, in my think tank, we made a poll towards mayors about their expectations regarding security 1 year before the mayor's election. And we expected that they would want more money, more gear for the local cops and everything. But the first item that came out was they wanted to be partners of the state in decisions of allocating migrants all around France. They didn't want to discover one morning that a train would come or a bus with 30 guys, no women, and that they had to deal with these 30 guys within 15 minutes with no heads up before. And it always ends the same way. Either they go to hotels, which leads us to the Irish situation, or which is more French, they put them in the sports areas. So all the school young French boys or girls who want to go to their sport lessons, they cannot go anymore because the migrants go to the gymnasium for 2, 3, 4 months, staying there, waiting for solutions. So this is an expectation. The first that came out, we want to be, we want the state to consult us before just sending us the migrants. And the second example is very enlightening. And during the 2023 riots in France, I discovered afterwards, I followed that. I mean, I had like 100 WhatsApp groups. I was in real time on everything. But there's something that I only discovered afterwards. It is that in many, many areas in France, once that the local police forces were overwhelmed within the 2 first days, after that it was better. But during the 2 first days, a lot of local police was overwhelmed. And things turned on that almost everywhere in France, some local guys from the population, sometimes 2 or 3 men, sometimes a little more, sometimes even 20 or 30, gathered like that spontaneously to go and to protect their belongings, to protect their cars on the parking lots, to protect their homes when they were attacked. And it was a spontaneous, it wasn't organized, it wasn't, but it happened. And a lot of local police told me, and they still tell me when I travel around France, that they were very surprised and happily surprised to see that part of the population, of course, a small part, but a part of the population was coming alone, sometimes with their, hunting guns and things like that, just to help them. So I put this in the debate because it's also a way for the politicians to understand that when the population will be back against the wall, some will fall and cry, but some will rise and fight.
Bon, je crois qu'il est dorénavant temps de conclure ce colloque passionnant. Merci à tous nos intervenants pour leurs éclairages respectifs. Alors, il y a beaucoup de questions qui restent en suspens et nous aurons certainement l'occasion d'y revenir à d'autres occasions. Mais simplement, voilà, face à ce diagnostic qui a été fait, qui recoupe d'ailleurs une étude qu'a réalisée et publiée notre fondation ECR sur les fameuses zones de non-droit, les no-go zones, qui décrivent le mécanisme de sociétés parallèles qui sont en sécession culturelle et qui échappent à l'autorité de l'État. Cette étude a un mérite important puisqu'elle démontre que le facteur de la pauvreté n'est pas le facteur unique et encore moins le facteur déterminant. Cette étude montre que parmi les deux paramètres qui sont bien souvent à l'origine du développement de ces no-go zones, il y a l'immigration et il y a l'islamisation. Et donc je voulais conclure sur le plan politique pour dire finalement que derrière ce risque de la guerre civile, il y a d'abord et avant tout la question de la démographie, la question de la loi du nombre, qui est évidemment un des facteurs déterminants, et que si cette trajectoire du nombre et de l'importation massive de populations étrangères à faible niveau socio-professionnel de pays islamiques se poursuit, évidemment, le schéma qui se dessine, je pense qu'il a été bien identifié, c'est demain de voir des nations européennes qui sont livrées à la fameuse narco-tyrannie et qui deviendraient des califats islamiques, une fois de plus par la loi du nombre. Et que c'est parce que des populations résisteront ou tenteront de résister, évidemment, à cette nouvelle définition de la société qu'il y a un risque de fait de guerre civile. Mais que néanmoins, une fois cela est dit, entre la situation qui est la nôtre aujourd'hui et demain la perspective de pays européens qui deviendraient des narco-tyrannies et des califats, eh bien, il y a une chose entre ces deux choses, c'est nous. Nous, c'est-à-dire la volonté politique. Et c'est la volonté politique qui peut contrarier cette trajectoire qui n'est pas une fatalité, qui n'est pas inéluctable, parce que la volonté d'un homme bien réalisé au bon moment peut changer l'histoire. Voilà. Et donc, je souhaitais conclure en disant que si ce risque, il est identifié et il existe, il n'est néanmoins pas une fatalité et que fort heureusement, il y a de plus en plus de responsables politiques tels que nous et d'autres qui ont conscience du problème et ont la ferme volonté d'endiguer ce risque et d'apporter une solution pour que nos sociétés redeviennent des sociétés harmonieuses, paisibles et tout simplement, évidemment, heureuses. Et donc, c'était un petit mot d'optimisme pour finalement clore ce sujet.
So, ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues, and the tens of thousands watching online, I want to end this afternoon by speaking from the heart, listening to Dr. Schoellhammer, Professor Betz, Dr. Lenihan, and Maitre de Montbrial has really moved me deeply. As I sat here and took it all in, I kept thinking back on the moment that I decided this event has to happen. It was when I listened to you, Dr. Betz, on Louise Perry's podcast. That was the moment I realized this topic is simply too important for us to shy away from out of fear of, let's say, political controversy, in order to just sleepwalking through our normalcy bias into disaster. For me, the most valuable thing about today is that we finally had the courage to discuss these difficult realities openly and honestly without euphemisms. That straightforward conversation leaves me feeling, believe it or not, genuinely hopeful. I see it in the polling numbers across Europe. I see it in the fact that young people in France, in Sweden, in Austria are no longer willing to stay silent. The ballot box is still open. The democratic reset is still possible. And history doesn't only go from 1788 to 1789. Sometimes it goes from 1788 to a peaceful, decisive turning point where society chooses the correct course before it's too late. Ralph spoke about our parties around Europe being the last hope for democracy. And I sometimes think of a quote attributed to Louis XV, France, après moi le déluge, after me the deluge. And this is the message I sometimes want to throw in the face to social democrats and liberals. You know, if we fail, just imagine what comes after us. We're doing our best. We're the best hope for this free, democratic, and Western society. And I want to say that it's not too late. Europe has not yet fallen. We are not powerless, and we're just in time. The storm clouds are real, but so is the wind that can blow them away. And I, for one, I am filled with a stubborn confidence that my children and grandchildren have a future in this Europe. And I will fight for it every day that I step up. To all of you who came here today and to all of the speakers, thank you from the bottom of my heart for your courage and your clarity. And thanks to the audience for staying until the end. It's been a long seminar. I'm biased, I know, but it's been one of the most interesting seminars I've been to during my political life, I must say. And especially in this building. So I would like to end by encourage you to leave here not heavier, but lighter, armed with truth and filled with determination. Thank you so much, and see you at the barricades, figuratively speaking. Thank you so much.